Good morning, and thanks for joining us. My name's Catherine Addington, and I'm an editorial fellow here at the American Conservative. I'm going to be stepping in as the moderator for this panel, which is What Religion Means for U.S. Foreign Policy. So I'd like to start by introducing our first panelist. We're going to be hearing from Damon Linker, Samuel Goldman, Noah Millman, and Father Thomas Zain. Our first speaker is Damon Linker. He's going to be discussing just war, and he's a senior correspondent at theweek.com, as well as a consulting editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press. He's also the author of two books, The Theocons and The Religious Test. Damon?
Thank you. Over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try to justify two claims. One is that much of what passes for just war reasoning in American political culture is a moral, intellectual, and theological fraud. Now, I'm a columnist, so I say things like that. Very strong opinions. And second, I want to argue that this form of just war reasoning that prevails in our culture should be considered incompatible with Christianity, rightly understood. So, the first point. Christian just war theorizing has exercised an enormous influence on American thinking about war and peace over the past 2 generations. When it comes to judging conduct within a war that's already been declared, what's called jus in bello, that influence has been salutary. The Pentagon now works very hard to ensure that in any given mission, our military uses no more force than is necessary to vindicate the cause, and that it refrains from intentionally killing civilians, that we now expect our armed forces to abide by these rules of war and judge other states severely when their soldiers don't do the same is unquestionably a good thing. But that's not where most of the intellectual action is found among those who champion just war thinking today. That action is focused on the criteria for determining when it's just to go to war in the first place, which is called jus ad bellum. This is what makes just war thinking so very appealing to foreign policy hawks of various stripes, neoconservatives, liberal interventionists, and realists who define American national interests very broadly. This is also what makes so much of contemporary just war thinking a scam. To see why, consider the 6 criteria just war theorists use to determine when a war is morally justified. The war must be undertaken with the intention of establishing a just peace. It must be defensive. It must be aimed at protecting the innocent from unjust aggression. It must have a reasonable chance of success. It must be declared and waged by a competent governing authority. And the 6th point, it must be undertaken as a last resort. If the war meets these 6 criteria, it can be considered morally justified. Now, here's my question. Is there any realistic scenario in which, judged by these criteria, the 21st century United States would start and wage an unjust war? I submit that the answer is an unequivocal no. We always have a moral rationale for undertaking more military action. We always consider our actions to be defensive, even when the aggression hasn't happened yet. We always believe that our actions are aimed at protecting the innocent. We always think we have a reasonable chance of success. We always consider ourselves to be a competent governing authority, and we always claim to have waited as long as possible to act. And this is, of course, without anyone engaging in this kind of a calculus. It's just kind of baked into the conversation and the decision-making in Washington and in the government. If Americans were the rapacious marauders that Noam Chomsky thinks we are, then, or like, for instance, if, for example, we were contemplating an invasion of Canada to take the tar sands oil fields for our own use, say, then ad bellum criteria might be a useful way of rendering judgment of our actions, reining them in, and directing them toward more moral ends. But, of course, the United States doesn't behave that way. We're inclined to start or join wars for the loftiest of moral reasons. Given this fact, ad bellum considerations primarily provide an additional moral and theological imprimatur for actions that we would be inclined to do anyway. The U.S.'s default setting is to careen toward conflict, but the loudest champions of just war thinking, people like George Weigel, James Turner Johnson, Nigel Bigger, believe it's necessary to step harder on the gas because they fear that what they call a presumption against war has taken hold in the Western world. Reading their writings, you'd think that the foreign policy establishments of the United States and Great Britain were dominated by pacifists. In their view, this presumption against war focuses too single-mindedly on the, as they put it, terrible evils that are wrought by war, while downplaying the fact that not going to war permits evils of its own. Now, true enough, evil arises both from acts of omission and from acts of commission. But there are just three problems, probably way more than that, but I'll talk about three. First, states have different moral obligations than individuals. When an individual refuses to come to the aid of a victim of injustice, we rightly judge him harshly for failing to fulfill his moral duty. But the primary and overriding duty of a government is to uphold the nation's common good and defend its citizens against external harm or attack. If that sounds selfish, that's because it is. Our government's duty is to us. It can have no duty to the citizens of another nation. That doesn't mean that if, say, you're a Christian and you're an American citizen, you don't feel a duty to help those in other parts of the world through charity or even by signing up to become a mercenary on the other side of a conflict or volunteering in all kinds of ways. I'm talking about the duty of the government and those we elect to government. Second, to insist that policymakers base the decision on whether to go to war on the supposition that a failure to act will result in worse moral atrocities than if they do act is to place a black box of uncertainty or negative evidence at the core of deliberation. And that can lead to massive blunders, as we saw very vividly in the arguments leading up to the start of the Iraq War. You probably recall from that time, the arguments always proceeded where someone who was critical of going to war in Iraq would say, you shouldn't, these bad consequences are likely to follow from it. And the response is always, but not acting will be worse. Okay, where does that argument go? I mean, you're arguing kind of with first-order uncertainty with second-order uncertainty. And I think that that's kind of stacking the deck in a way that leads the interventionists always to win. Third, Americans sometimes worry about the risks and costs involved in the United States acting as the world's policeman. But what advocates of just war reasoning have in mind is far more sweeping. They would empower the U.S. to serve as nothing less than the world's moral judge, jury, and executioner, meting out punishment for transgressions of justice around the globe. This is an extremely bad idea. Americans are already too inclined to believe in their own righteousness. Their tendency toward what Alexis de Tocqueville called the perpetual utterance of self-applause often leads them to make foolish mistakes. They certainly don't need theologians telling them that their good intentions entitle them, over the inevitable objections of billions of their would-be subjects, to appoint themselves the world's benevolent despot, or benevolent global hegemon, if you prefer. So much for the wisdom of contemporary just war thinking. But is it even Christian? On one level, the answer is an obvious yes. Just war theory originally took shape in the writings of a series of Christian thinkers. I won't bother listing them right now for the sake of time. But it originally, as at least the criteria that are used today, arose in the writings of Christian thinkers. But that doesn't mean that these thinkers were justified in treating Christianity as compatible with war-making. A powerful dissenting tradition of Christian thinking strongly, and to my mind persuasively, rejects the easy linkage between ad bellum reasoning about war and authentic Christianity. For John Howard Yoder, Stanley Hauerwas, and Richard Hayes, the Christian acceptance of violence and the attempt to establish rational criteria to justify it can be traced to the 4th century reign of Constantine the Great, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. Up until that time, Christians expected Christ's imminent return, and as members of a marginal persecuted sect, they gave little thought to the burdens and responsibilities of political rule. But once Christians held positions of worldly power through what was now officially a Christian empire, their outlook changed. Whereas many formerly renounced violence, now they fashioned arguments to distinguish between violence that was legitimate and illegitimate, justified and unjustified, with morally right motives and intentions serving as the decisive consideration. As long as a Christian in a position of political and ecclesiastical authority meant well, recourse to violence could be acceptable and compatible with Christian faith. Just war theory grew out of this change in moral orientation. I'd like to suggest that the kind of moral calculus about killing that just war theory recommends and exemplifies, especially when it comes to the decision to initiate military action, has no plausible connection to the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Christ taught that we should love our neighbors, and despite what Augustine apparently believed, nowhere did Jesus indicate or imply that it's possible to express that love in the act of killing them. Christ also taught to turn the other cheek, to forgive our enemies for their transgressions against us, and to refrain from responding to an attack by taking a perfectly proportional eye for an eye. And then there's Christ's willing acceptance of conviction, torture, crucifixion, and death, a chilling indictment of the horrible deficiencies of the worldly order of things and the injustice that so often prevails within it. To which a contemporary just warrior might indignantly reply, but the United States is far more moral than a provincial outpost of the first century Roman Empire. Indeed it is. But is it different in kind and in the decisive respect? The answer, I think, is no. Human beings still judge poorly in their own cases. They still deceive themselves about their own righteousness. They still fool themselves into believing that their motives and intentions are pure when pride is really what's driving them. And when these traits are amplified into collective endeavors and backed up by armed state power, the logic of self-interest becomes overwhelming and inescapable. Prideful self-regard is woven into the very fabric of our world. In particular cases, perhaps an individual can act out of authentic, self-abnegating love for another. But as a group, that is nearly always impossible, at least in this vale of tears. Now, let me be very clear. I harbor no illusions about the likelihood of establishing peace on earth. On the contrary, like so much of his teaching, Christ's commitment to nonviolence defies the innermost logic of the world, cuts against the grain of human nature, and subverts the self-interested order that governs collective life. But Christians should be honest enough to admit that in continuing to exercise political rule and in fighting, using force, and killing, they are falling far short of the otherworldly purity to which they have been called by the God they profess to worship and revere. So, in conclusion, by all means, let's argue about war and peace, justice and God. And if, after all the arguments have been made, we're thoroughly convinced of the need to drop bombs and deploy troops, then let's go to war with as much restraint and humility as we can muster. But please, let's not make fools of ourselves by imagining that in doing so, we have Jesus Christ on our side, nodding and smiling at the slaughter. The end.
Thank you, Damon. Our second speaker is Samuel Goldman, who will speak about a forgotten kind of Zionism, that is, why liberal Christians used to love Israel. He is an assistant professor of political science at the George Washington University, as well as the director of the Politics and Values program here. In addition, he is a contributing editor at the American Conservative. Sam?
Thank you. So Damon is a columnist, and it's his job description to provoke. I'm a professor, so my remarks will be more measured. Christian Zionism is the most vivid contemporary expression of religious influence on American foreign policy. For millions of American Christians, mostly but not exclusively conservative Protestants, America has an obligation to the State of Israel based not only on its national interests, but also and primarily on its obligation to a higher power. In March 2002, less than a year after the 9/11 attacks, Senator James Inhofe summarized this belief when he told the United States Senate that, quote, "I believe very strongly that we ought to support Israel, that it has a right to the land. This is the most important reason, because God said so." And Inhofe went on to explain that America's relationship to Israel and Israel's relation to the Palestinians, quote, "is not a political battle at all. It is a contest over whether or not the Word of God is true." Inhofe's words are unusual in their bluntness, but in fact they emerge from a very old current in America's theologico-political imagination. Ever since John Winthrop's fleet landed on the coast of Massachusetts Bay, considerable numbers of American Christians have believed that they have a special role to play in the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham and his descendants. By way of example, consider Peter Bulkley, a founder of the town of Concord and a pillar of the first Puritan generation in New England. In a book called The Gospel Covenant, published in 1651, so you can get it from the library if you want it, Bulkley argues that by virtue of the covenant made with their fathers, the Jews shall be delivered out of the bondage in which they are now holden. And he then explains that the Jews' deliverance from bondage would culminate in their resettlement in Palestine, an event that he associated with their conversion to Christianity. Here's another example from Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather and a leading minister of the second New England generation. Increase Mather continued Bulkley's argument and insisted that the achievement of the liberation of Israel depended on the steadfast piety of Christians in America. So he urged his fellow Puritans, quote, to pour forth earnest and continual prayer, and it will hasten the birth of Zion, that even a nation shall be born in one day. So Inhofe was not saying anything unprecedented when he called upon America to pursue a divinely inspired foreign policy in regard to Jews and Israel. Rather than an offshoot of the post-war evangelical revival, Christian Zionism is in fact part of the Puritan and Calvinist inheritance that remains an important part of American culture. But maybe it isn't very surprising that people who are described, often erroneously, as fundamentalists would share certain theological and political commitments with earlier generations of religious enthusiasts. Surely liberal Christians, more comfortable in the modern world and more open to evolving interpretations of Scripture, would have long since given up their ancestors' obsession with divine promises that can be redeemed for real estate. Well, you would think so if you follow the policy of the so-called mainline churches. Last year, for example, the Presbyterian Church USA voted to divest from companies that it regards as participants in the occupation of the West Bank. But while the enthusiasm of conservative Christians for Israel has deeper roots than many people realize, the skeptical attitudes of liberal churches and clergy is also a surprisingly recent development. From about the foundation of the State of Israel until the 1967 war, mainstream Christian opinion in the United States was distinctly favorable to Israel and to Zionism. The great symbol of this liberal consensus was Reinhold Niebuhr. Although he is remembered as a theorist of realism and restraint, Niebuhr actually had a long-standing and very public affection for the State of Israel. In a 1957 article for the New Republic, Niebuhr celebrated the state as, quote, a glorious spiritual and political achievement. Asserting America's duty to secure this achievement by means of an allusion to the Gettysburg Address, Niebuhr concluded that the primary condition of its existence is our word. He's speaking as an American, is our word that we will not allow any nation so conceived and so dedicated to perish from the earth. Now, I'm not claiming that Niebuhr had the same views about covenants as Inhofe, let alone as Peter Bulkley. Niebuhr denied that God gave Palestine specifically to the Jews. He also described himself as embarrassed by hopes that the establishment of a Jewish state would lead to the second coming of Christ. Niebuhr's pro-Zionism was much less theological than that. Nevertheless, in Niebuhr's view, the establishment of a Jewish state was made necessary by the persistence of anti-Jewish persecution that culminated in the Holocaust. According to Niebuhr, national and cultural groups have a right to life, as well as the individuals that compose them. And since the world had made clear that it would not allow the Jews to enjoy a secure collective existence, he reasoned that they had to have a state of their own. Now, the same argument could be used to justify the national claims of the Irish or the Catalans or indeed the Palestinian Arabs. But Niebuhr argued that several considerations imposed on Christians a specific concern for promoting the national self-determination of Jews. The first consideration was Christian responsibility for anti-Semitism. Niebuhr was among the first American theologians to argue that hostility to the Jews was not simply an aberration, but rather had deep roots in the Christian tradition. This observation implied that Christians bore a special burden for ameliorating the consequences of anti-Semitism. In Niebuhr's view, since Christian hatred for Jews was what had made the State of Israel necessary, it would be hypocritical for Christians to deny their support on ostensibly religious grounds. The second consideration had to do with Niebuhr's understanding of providence. Niebuhr denied that human beings can foresee the future or that God has revealed the future for our benefit. But he also thought that we need to be able to find some kind of order in history. That if we cannot discern a pattern, a goal, then reflection on time offers only an endless procession of horrors. Well, for Niebuhr, establishment of a Jewish state in the traditional land of promise was the most vivid imaginable indication that such a pattern exists. Even if it was not literally predetermined by God, the modern realization of an ancient hope provided a point of contact between faith and history. And in this sense, Niebuhr did not hesitate to describe what he called the birth and growth of the State of Israel as a miracle. Rather than a merely political event, it vindicated the possibility of redemption in history. Finally, Niebuhr identified a remarkable and conceivably providential link between the State of Israel and the United States. Returning to the Puritan sources that I mentioned and that were at this time in the 50s and 60s in the process of rediscovery and reinterpretation by Niebuhr's friend and interlocutor Perry Miller, Niebuhr found a sort of awesome historical irony in the patronage of a Jewish state by a nation that was itself founded on an analogy to the biblical Hebrews. By offering support and assistance to the State of Israel today, the new Israel seemed to come to aid to the old. Niebuhr and his students devoted more energy to the elaboration of these considerations than other religious figures in the 50s and 60s. But they appear in more or less condensed form throughout the religious and political literature of the time, and not only in learned journals or the bulletins of clerical associations. To mention just one example from popular culture, think of the film, and particularly the film, less so than the book, Exodus, in which a young American Presbyterian, played by Eva Marie Saint, comes to appreciate the Jewish claim on the land of Israel. So what happened to the pro-Israel sentiment that characterized mainline Protestantism in the 50s and 60s, and which has been virtually forgotten? The answer, in one word, is Vietnam. In 1960, liberal churches and theologians generally regarded American power and the history that had produced it as a good thing. The idea of an exceptional nation, rooted in a distinctive religious mission and with special international responsibilities, was popular on the left as well as on the right. But by the late 60s, this was no longer the case. Revulsion at the war in Southeast Asia provoked an extensive revision of liberal political theology, often involving critique of the myths that enshroud American foreign policy. And in many respects, Niebuhr was a forerunner of this revision. So his best-known book, The Irony of American History, includes a profound challenge to the illusion of American benevolence. Niebuhr's own opposition to the Vietnam War was based on this kind of reflection. But he regarded America's relationship to Israel as a very different issue, due to the special debt owed by Christians to Jews, in his opinion, and also to the historically and politically genuine rather than merely cynical relationship between the United States and the State of Israel. So when war broke out in late spring, early summer 1967, Niebuhr wrote a number of articles and signed public statements offering support for Israel, specifically in his capacity as a Christian theologian. Now, Niebuhr may have expected his colleagues to follow his lead, as many had done in the past. But if that was his expectation, then he was mistaken. Beginning in May 1967, the liberal religious press and pulpit began to ring with criticism of Israeli policy and the support for it by the United States. Now, some of this criticism emanated from old allies of the Middle Eastern missionary movement, who had always been very critical of the State of Israel. But a lot of it was rooted in a new theology of peace and rigorous morality, developed to justify opposition to the Vietnam War. America, after all, appeared to be an aggressive and colonial power, a bully and a hypocrite. Well, was that not also true of Israel? But at the same time that liberal Christians were drifting away from Israel, conservative Christians were drifting toward it. While many liberals treated Israel's capture of the old city of Jerusalem with dismay, conservatives hailed it as the long-awaited fulfillment of biblical prophecy. These Christians did not need Niebuhr's elaborate reflections on history or on Jewish-Christians relations. As Senator Inhofe's comments suggest, they had something much more immediately accessible and much more certain, namely the inerrant Word of God. So by the end of his life, Niebuhr had become rather a lonely figure, both politically and theologically. Less than a year after his death in 1971, he suffered the indignity of becoming the subject of a public controversy after his widow, Ursula Niebuhr, asked that his name be removed from the masthead of Christianity and Crisis, a journal that he had founded to support American intervention in World War II. And Mrs. Niebuhr asked that his name be removed to protest the magazine's increasingly critical view of Israel. So the post-war consensus that Niebuhr helped to construct and personally represented proved to be as brittle as it was broad. Built to make sense of America's unprecedented position in the wake of the Second World War, it turned out to be unable to hold together dueling tendencies toward realism and idealism, skepticism and faith, criticism and affirmation, human interests and religious responsibilities. One casualty of this breakdown was the optimistic but also self-critical form of civil religion that seems so old-fashioned when we encounter it in old books or in dusty archives. And it remains, I think, a relic, perhaps an unlamented relic, of a very different time. But another casualty was the still less familiar brand of Christian Zionism that combined religious interpretations of Jewish destiny and American power with an appreciation for the limits of religion and politics and the limits of politics itself. I think that our civil life is poorer for its disappearance.
Good. Thank you, Sam. Our third speaker, Noah Millman, will address the rise of Messianic politics in contemporary Judaism, and he is a senior editor at the American Conservative. Noah?
Thank you. So my My two co-panelists talked primarily about religious currents in the United States and how they affect our foreign policy. I'm going to talk more about religious currents overseas and how those affect the shape of our foreign policy right now. The obvious place to talk about is the Middle East, which is racked by sectarian conflict, most notably in Iraq and Syria. I don't have a great deal of expertise on the Sunni, the transformation of the Sunni world, the transformation of the rise of Shiism, and unlike a lot of commentators, I'm not going to pretend that I have that expertise when I don't. I'm an amateur at anything, but even I know when I don't know enough to say much. I'm going to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which also is one of our oldest commitments in the Middle East, and one that's still fairly central to our engagement in that region. So our American foreign policy for at least the last generation, and arguably for two generations, towards Israel and Palestine has been anchored on two ideas: that we should support Israel, its right to exist, its right to defend itself, and that we should facilitate a compromise solution of some sort to the Palestinian problem, the problem of statelessness of the Palestinian people in the wake of the creation of the State of Israel. And that framework for our policymaking in the region assumes that what we're dealing with is a conflict of nationalisms and a conflict of interests. Israel has certain security interests as well as other material interests, and the Palestinians also have material interests, which, if that's what we're dealing with, then a compromise should theoretically be possible. And the question is, what set of incentives would facilitate that happening? And the spectrum in American foreign policy in the region tended over time to range from greater support of Israel and the assumption that anchoring that support more firmly will eventually convince the other side to compromise more, or taking a more even-handed approach of pressuring both sides to come to the table. And you've seen different administrations in different places on that spectrum. Is that framing, though, still accurate? Well, I think it used to be unquestionably accurate. If you go back to the origins of political Zionism, it was overwhelmingly a secular movement. Indeed, in its most dominant variant, in labor Zionism, it was an anti-religious movement, one that self-consciously tried to remake the Jewish people as something more akin to a modern nation and with a modern state, something that would be recognized as comparable to the Irish people in Ireland, Hungarians in Hungary, and that fit within a sort of a Wilsonian framework for how the world should be organized. And to that extent, the socialists, labor Zionists, actively abandoned and religious traditions, or remade them into more national traditions, going as far as creating a new language, the modern Hebrew language, which was a transformation of an ancient religious language into something that could serve as the language of a modern people engaged in commerce and so forth. Opposition within the religious world, predominantly both the more liberal and the more Orthodox variants were predominantly anti-Zionist. So within the ultra-Orthodox world, Zionism was considered heretical, with the exception of one important rabbi. Why is that? There's a traditional Gemara that speaks of 3 oaths that were administered by God in the wake of the second exile and the destruction of the Second Temple, that Jews are not supposed to forcibly return to the land, forcibly ascend the wall, that Jews are not supposed to rebel against the states in which they live, and the nations around are not supposed to oppress the Jews unduly. This is the basis of this text is the basis of traditional ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism and opposition to the whole Zionist program in the pre-state period and extending into the post-state period. Within the Reform world, the Reform Judaism coming from the mid-19th century Germany, and as it developed also in the United States and elsewhere in Europe, also by and large took an anti-Zionist line on the grounds that in the context of modernity, the Jewish community should be conceived of as a religious community that exists in a variety of different nations, and the Jewish people should be completely loyal citizens of one state, and the idea of a Jewish state is an anachronism and conflicts with that idea of emancipated assimilation than a secular state. And that didn't change in the United States really until Louis Brandeis made a liberal argument for Zionism, again on basically Wilsonian grounds, that the Jewish people, just like any other, just like the Irish people or Hungarian people or whatever, deserve a state that individual Jews can choose to live in or not. It was not primarily the kind of nationalist argument that European Zionists were making. On the Arab side as well, Arab nationalism was not particularly sectarian. Indeed, a substantial leadership role in Palestinian nationalism, as well as in other Arab nationalisms, was played by Christians. And one reason for that is that Christians were minorities in the Arab world. They were frequently more advantaged minorities. They benefited under European colonialism relative to what to the general Muslim population. But they were a minority, and they understood that. And secular nationalism was a way to be equal partners in state building that they wouldn't have in a more religious-dominated form of discourse. And the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians for for the first couple of decades of Israel's existence was a conflict over the same land and who owned it. So it was the kind of conflict that we think of it as being. That context started to change in '67 and has continued to today, and now I think the context is very different, and it's reasonable to describe the conflict as increasingly religious in character on both sides, and that has some implications for how we approach it and how and what we can do about it. Jewish religious radicalism really began to take off immediately after the '67 war. One of the first illegal settlements was in the ancient city of Hebron. It was set up without government approval by a bunch of religious Zionists. So this was a very minority position at the time, and was justified on the grounds that this is, the capture of the Judea and Samaria was a sign of the fulfillment of prophecy, and so there is an actual religious obligation to hasten that process. What began as a relatively small dispensation within the Jewish religious community has become an increasingly important one. The settler population has grown substantially since '67. It's grown even more substantially since the Oslo Accords began. And religious Zionism has become a more and more important force within the Israeli right, to the point where I've seen it mentioned that something like 40% of the officer corps of the Israeli armed forces it can be described as from religious Zionists following one or another descendant of Rav Koch, the founder of Messianic religious Zionism. The ultra-Orthodox have also changed their attitudes, although formally their theology still argues that Zionism is heretical. They're an increasing percentage of the state and are more and more dependent on the state, and increasingly partake of attitudes that suggest that they sacralize, whether they recognize it or not, the state and its actions. So you can now find ultra-Orthodox rabbis arguing that it's a problem if the state if the state takes certain actions on the Sabbath, or it's a problem if the state gives back Holy Land, which would never have been the case decades ago. And the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, specifically has labored to build a kind of fusionist ideology that that could appeal to everyone from secular Russian voters who don't have really any interest in religion, but have generally right-wing attitudes toward war and peace and territory, to ultra-Orthodox voters, and a fusionist ideology that partakes of a kind of discourse about religion without itself being an explicitly religious ideology. All of this makes it, I think, increasingly difficult for the Israeli political system to behave in the pragmatic way that it was capable of doing a generation ago. On the Arab side, I think it's even more obvious that the religious groups have become increasingly dominant over secular nationalist viewpoints. Hamas began to rise in the 1980s with at least the tacit approval of the Israeli occupying authorities, who saw it as an alternative and a competitor to Fatah, which was their biggest opponent at the time. The Hezbollah group in Lebanon arose in response to the Israeli invasion there and became a private military force that is stronger than the Lebanese military itself, and arguably the most dominant force in the Lebanese political system. And more recently, we have the rise of extremist Sunni groups, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, all operating within Israel and Palestine. And you've seen the collapse of the legitimacy of secular states across the region, from the Palestinian Authority itself to most obviously Syria and Iraq. And as a consequence, and you have, it's important to point out, I think, that there's nobody in charge of these religious movements. That, in fact, in many cases, the people taking actions on behalf of on the one hand, on behalf, a sort of messianic Jewish view of the conflict, on the other hand, an Islamist view, may not be taking direction from anyone in particular. Spontaneous groups are developing on the internet, for example. And the most recent, what people are debating, if it's the third Intifada or not, seems notably unled and unstrategic in its objectives. How does the increasing religious character of the conflict affect that historic American policy toward the conflict? I would argue it makes the conflict much less tractable. And in particular, it makes it very difficult for the United States to mediate, because as an outside power, regardless of where we want to put pressure, we don't have the standing to take sides in internal religious disputes. The United States is in no position to tell Muslim groups, you're not really Islamic, this other thing is really Islamic, or, you should be more like moderate Muslims. And we're also not in a position to do that with Jewish groups, to tell religious Jews, this is not, really what your religion says. It is difficult enough to tell people that they don't know their own material interests well enough and that they should be more enlightened about that. It is that much more difficult to say you don't understand your own tradition. And so I think the most important implication is that if the conflict is going to be resolved in any fashion, it's only going to be resolved if state actors are strengthened. And the only people who can strengthen state actors are the states themselves. The United States has very limited capacity to do that. What we can do is try to align incentives in such a way that the states in question see that they bear the responsibility of their own actions. So the Israeli state still has primacy within Israel and has the ability, if it chooses to bring elements that might refuse to go along with any kind of agreement under control. There are states that are still stable within the Middle East on the Muslim side of the line that bear some responsibility for support for non-state actors and can see their responsibility and can face the consequences themselves of their own actions if the United States is willing to let those consequences take place. I think at this point that our tendency to say our job is to reassure all sides that we support them and want their best interests may be having the perverse impact of telling all sides that they don't actually bear the full responsibility of their own positions. And it behooves us to take more of a position of protecting ourselves from over-identification with decisions that get made and limiting our support to in extremis situations while saying that the diplomatic and political consequences of normal course of business behavior are going to fall on the actors themselves. And that applies to primarily our allies who are on both sides of the conflict. That doesn't enable us to solve the conflict, but the solution is going to have to come from those internal dynamics of those actors. It's not going to be able to be dictated from the outside, and especially not as it has become a more religious-driven situation.
Thank you, Noah. Our fourth and final speaker, Father Thomas Zain, will address church-state relations and the refugee crisis. He is the Vicar General of the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America, as well as the Dean of St. Nicholas Antiochian Cathedral in Brooklyn, New York. And in addition to those duties, he is a lecturer in pastoral theology at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in Crestwood, New York.
Thank you. So I wanted to speak mainly about what's going on in Syria with the Christians and throughout the Middle East. But just to back up a little bit, what consideration does U.S. foreign policy give when considering the role of religion in these various countries where it acts or interferes or promotes change? And we see the results of this policy going back several years in recent times in a couple of vivid examples. For example, during the war in Bosnia and Serbia, that they decided to bomb Serbia during the Orthodox Holy Week without consideration for how important that was to the inhabitants there. Also, we see in the conflict now with Russia, the idea that we are pushing not only for change in places like Ukraine, but also to influence those areas through moving NATO into those areas with our sense of morality or immorality, depending on how you look at it, with several modern-day moral issues and so on. So the idea of pushing our values up to the borders of what is considered Holy Rus, the ancient capital of Kiev of the Slavic nation. And these are a couple examples. And then we look then to the Middle East and the Christians and other minorities of the Middle East that have been adversely affected by the so-called Arab Spring. We tend to refer to it more as the Arab Winter. To supposedly bring democracy to the region. But one doesn't need to be an expert in foreign policy to see the contradictions there, because how can we be talking about bringing democracy to Syria, for example, or Iraq, where women could drive cars and go to college and universities and teach and have positions in the government, and yet we are such a strong ally of Saudi Arabia, where women cannot drive or cannot even go to a soccer match. And now Saudi Arabia is trying to tell Syria about democracy and change. So, if we look at the examples of what has happened to date through this so-called Arab Spring, with Libya, we have a disaster. With Egypt, save the strong Egyptian army, there was a disaster there. We removed or allowed Mubarak to be removed. And then we said, let's have an election. And then they elected the Brotherhood. And we didn't like that, and saved the strong Egyptian army, who went in and restored some type of cohesion and unity, and President Sisi came into power. That would have been another disaster. President Sisi is not much different than President Mubarak or President Assad in Syria in his policies and his outlook on things, yet he is considered by most foreign policy experts in the United States to be some kind of hero, where these others are some kind of ravaging dictators. We see then in Iraq the disaster that happened there. Despite our billions of dollars and despite our thousands of troops who suffered, lost their lives, came back maimed, and the countless tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians who died there because of our invasion. And the Christians are all but non-existent in Iraq now. Sadly, they fled to Syria, because Syria was a place that was safe for Christians until just a few years ago, and other minorities. We cannot forget the other minorities. And then the agitation started in Syria. Anyone who's naive enough to think that this all was a result of some demonstrations for democracy that were crushed in the early months is sadly lacking a perspective on foreign policy and what goes on in the world, and especially in the Middle East. Now we have a situation in Syria where all the minority groups are suffering terribly. Since the war started, many have fled. Many have gone to the coastal regions where they are safe under government control, or to Damascus, and others are finding their way into Lebanon and living there. This has created a humanitarian disaster for us. We have, as some of you may know, for example, these are examples only, because there are many other people, but 2 bishops who have been kidnapped for more than 2 years now, the brother of our patriarch. We have priests who have been killed, been mutilated, all in a place where I was there in 2010, and we were having processions in the streets on Easter in front of everybody, where people coexisted peacefully, and where there may have been a lack of political freedom, but that is not the highest aspiration for most Syrian people. Their faith and their religion is paramount, and their country and their citizenship comes before individual rights. So what about a solution? Some advocate for the protection of Christians and other minorities, or for enclaves, as a matter of our policy, our foreign policy, or a matter of what to do to protect the people. But we do not need protection, we need peace. And sadly, our U.S. foreign policy has been a disaster. We say who we are against. We are against the Syrian government, we are against ISIS, we are against Jabhat al-Nusra and the other Islamic extremist groups. But who are we for? Who are we for? Some imaginary moderates that don't really exist? So we are stuck. And while we are stuck, the people are suffering. And Russia has come to try to bring some stability to that area. Whether what the motivation of their reasons, I will leave to you. But the idea that they are coming to bring some stability, because if the government collapses, we will have worse than Iraq and worse than Libya and worse than Egypt and worse than all those other places if the Syrian government collapses. So we have to come to some conclusion. And the final word, so we leave some time for questions about refugees. Why are the refugees leaving? Why all of a sudden are the refugees leaving that area? Why? What about the Christians in the other parts of the Middle East? If we look back, for example, at the number of Christians in modern-day Israel as of 1948 and how many exist today, for many of the reasons my colleague stated, that number has dwindled drastically also, especially after 1967. And as my colleague stated, they were part of the nationalist movement, so they weren't leaving because of Islamic persecution, they were leaving because of the Israeli occupation. So all these factors have caused a drain on the Christians in the Middle East, and the only thing that will solve the problem is for peace to come to that land, not for protection, not for change in government, because we know the disaster that has happened since all these wars and the so-called Arab Spring have begun. Thank you.
So unfortunately, due to a bit of a time crunch, we're not going to be able to take questions, but please do feel free to, if you're on Twitter, hashtag New Way Forward. We're excited to hear from you. So please stay for our next panel, which is The State in Modern War, immediately following this. And thank you to our panelists for their contributions.